Hello and welcome to the Year 8 Taste a Day assessment lesson. Today we're going to be starting with a bit of home front boggle to try and get your minds working and thinking about some key words that we've learned over the last few lessons. So here we've got a list of letters, and what I'd like you to do is try and create lots of words, hopefully to do with the home front, using these letters. For each word that's just a general word, you get 1.4, and you get 5 points for any words that are related to the home front and what we've been studying. So this is just a little bit of a challenge to yourself to try and see what words that you can come up with to do with what we've been studying recently. So have a little look at this, pause the video here and spend just a couple of minutes seeing what words you can come up with, and then I'll talk about the answers after. So there were lots of different words that you could have got using those letters that are on the board. Now obviously there are loads of 1.1s that are just general words and not to do with the home front. But when it comes to the home front, you could have had some of the following to get some of the marks. You could have talked about tea or jam. Both of those are worth 5 marks because they're to do with what we studied with rationing. You could have also had Dora, you could have had canary to do with women in World War I, munitions or rationing. So total up your points and see what you got. So today is the last of our online GCSE taster lessons, giving you a little bit of a flavour of what History GCSE is really like. Now obviously we've been studying some really interesting stuff about the British home front in the First World War. We've done a lesson looking at rationing, we've done a lesson looking at the Defence of the Realm Act, and we've also looked at the role of women in World War I. Now we're going to bring it all together into a 16-mark GCSE style question, and we're giving you a little bit of a challenge with this. Now we're going to be helping you throughout this video, so don't worry if you're feeling a little bit nervous. You're going to give it your absolute best go, and I'm sure you're going to do a really good job. Now once you've done this piece of work today, it's really important that everybody sends it to their teacher through the assignment tab on Teams, or email it to us if you don't know how to work Teams and you're struggling. Even if you don't get the whole way through the assessment, it's still important that we can see how well you've progressed with this and how well you understand the content that we've done. So today we are going to be doing that GCSE style question, and the question is at the bottom here, and I'd like you to write this down for me. Now it's up to you where you write this. You could write it in your book or on a piece of paper, but if you want to make it a little bit easier for yourself, it would be a great idea to do this on a Word document, because then you can very easily upload it to Teams assignments afterwards. So the question that I'd like you to write down is: rationing was the most important change introduced by the government on the home front in World War I. How far do you agree with the statement? So we're going to be doing an extended answer. It's going to be 4 paragraphs, and this is part of your Year 8 assessment work, but it's also going to give you a bit of a flavour of the GCSE style questions. So write this down, pause the video if you need to, and then I'll move on to explaining exactly what's going to go into your answer. So to answer this question, you're going to be writing 4 paragraphs, and you're going to write for about 20 minutes in total. You're going to have a first paragraph talking about rationing, because you can see that's the factor that's been mentioned in the question. It's saying rationing was the most important change introduced by the government on the home front. So you're going to have to talk about what rationing was and why this helped Britain win the war. Once you've done that, you need to move on to a different factor, and you can do paragraphs 2 and 3 in a different order, or you can follow the structure exactly. So next, personally, I would then do Dora, and I would talk all about the Defence of the Realm Act, and again, make sure I'm linking back to the question, explaining why that was an important change. How did that help Britain win the war? Then I would then do a paragraph on women, and again, linking back to the question. And then finally, you'd write a conclusion where you share your ideas and you put down your opinion about which aspect of the home front was the most important. Now I'll be talking you through each of the sections and talking to you about exactly what kind of things to put in it. But remember, you are going to need to use your class notes from the last 3 lessons. So lots of you were emailing your classwork in, you're putting it on assignments, you've done a really good job. All of those wonderful notes that you have been putting effort into the last couple of weeks will all help you with this next question that we're doing. So we're going to begin with just recapping rationing. So this is just a brief overview of the main things that hopefully you'll remember about rationing from your lesson. So first of all, we want to think about the situation, the problem. Why did rationing need to be brought in the first place? Well, most of that is because British food often came from abroad. Now, the Germans knew that, and therefore they began a policy of using their U-boats, their submarines, to try and sink armed merchant ships that brought the food in. By 1917, they were sinking 1 in every 4 of our ships that were bringing in food. And obviously this caused a massive problem of food shortages in England. So therefore, the government did try and deal with this problem. They wanted to try and make sure that they didn't have to introduce something like rationing. And they tried lots of things before they made the decision in January 1918 that they needed to actually limit the amount that we could buy. So first of all, they used DORA to try and take over land in order to grow more crops for food. So lots of places like playing parks were used, lots of allotments were created. Any green space that they could find and plant food in, they tried to use. So they wanted to grow more so we didn't have to rely on importing lots of food from abroad. They also set up the Land Army in 1917. This is where they basically asked for lots of middle-class women in particular to go to the countryside and work on the farms. They wanted lots of people to replace those farmers that had then been conscripted and were now fighting in the First World War. They also produced lots of posters like the one that you can see on the right, trying to encourage people to limit the amount of food that they were eating and to try and win the war that way. They also then tried volunteer rationing and things like meatless days, and even the royal family tried to lead by example. But despite all of these wonderful attempts at trying to help the food situation, they still found a problem, and that is that food prices were going up because of the shortage of food. So they decided to introduce rationing in January 1918. This didn't ration everything, but it included things like jam, tea, bacon, lard and sugar. And then they encouraged people to pad out their diet with other things that they could grow themselves, like their own vegetables. Now, this was generally welcomed by the people of Britain. People saw this as pretty fair because now everybody had equal access and it wasn't about the rich being able to afford the higher prices. It also helped to avoid a food crisis and actually needed to go on even after the war ended. You know, things like sugar weren't stopped rationing until about October 1919. Now, overall, you'll have your own idea about how important rationing was to helping the British war effort, but we can really see this when we compare it to the German food situation. Now, in Germany, they were experiencing food shortages as well because the British were stopping food getting into Germany and trying to starve them into submission as well. And actually, as a result of that, 400,000 Germans died of either starvation or illnesses linked to malnutrition. So in lots of ways, the British system was much more effective than what was going on in Germany. And actually, it wasn't quite as severe in terms of the impact on the British people. So make sure that you've got some good notes on rationing. You should have covered all of that from the class notes. And next, we're going to talk about how you're going to write your paragraph on rationing. So in your paragraph, you're going to want to try and include things like why rationing was needed, what rationing actually was, what it did, what types of things were rationed, and also you're going to want to link back to the question and explain why this helped Britain's home front. Basically, why did this help Britain win the war? There's some sentence starters that you can use if you want to for the first and second half of your paragraph. But the idea here is that you are writing in as much detail as you can, explaining all of your knowledge, including all of those wonderful details. Use your documentary notes, use your comprehension notes, and you've got about 5 minutes to write this paragraph. Now, if you do need longer than 5 minutes, that's fine. You can pause it afterwards and spend a couple of extra minutes on rationing, but don't spend too long. One of the challenges of GCSE questions is that you'll be writing quite a lot in quite a short space of time. But obviously, by the time that you get to year 9, 10 and 11, you'll get quicker and quicker at writing. So if you're struggling with the timings at the moment, don't let that put you off GCSE history, because you will get faster the more you practice, and we'd have years to be able to get there. So I'm going to start the timer now. Try and get it done in 5 minutes if you can, but if you can't get it done in 5 minutes, then you can always pause it after. Okay, best of luck. The next area that you're going to have to write about is from Lesson 1, where we looked at DORA and the increase in government powers in World War One. So first of all, you need to remember that DORA stands for the Defence of the Realm Act and was introduced in 1914 in the year that the war started. Now, there were loads of different powers that the government now had, and you can see some of them listed here with these bullet points. For instance, the government could now seize any land or buildings that it needed. Anything that was necessary for the war effort could be temporarily controlled by them and then handed back at the end of the war. For instance, they took over things like the coal industry because that was quite vital to the war effort. They also took over other areas as well, including mass media, the newspapers and the radio. This is because the government wanted to approve all of the news that came out, and they wanted to make sure that there was some level of censorship because they didn't want to undermine morale and support for the war effort. So they tried to make sure that newspaper articles reported on the events of the war in a positive way. They wanted to make sure that they told more stories of heroic deeds and acts rather than talking about the casualty numbers, which might upset a lot of the civilian population. So they introduced censorship, and that was quite a key aspect of DORA. And obviously, we wrote all about that in Lesson 1, and we thought about their control of the media. The next thing that they did was controlled the pubs, and they cut licence hours down, and they did things like watering down beer as well. All of that was about trying to help the war effort and making sure that the workers were turning up to work and making sure that they were ready to work hard in the factories or wherever they were working to help with the war effort. They also introduced in 1916 the idea of British summertime, where they were changing the clocks. The idea is that this would then mean that they were able to make more use of the daylight hours, and therefore it would make Britain more productive. As well as giving them powers like this, they also introduced Lloyd George as the new Minister for Munitions. Now, essentially, at some points, the British were running out of weapons and they needed to produce more in the time. So he had to try and solve the munitions crisis, even though he was facing the difficulty of men being conscripted into the army and therefore not having enough people to work in the factories. So what David Lloyd George did is he first of all made sure that skilled workers didn't have to go and fight in the war. He wanted them to be staying at home. So those men in reserved occupations where they were more useful at home stayed at home. And he also tried to get women to be working in munitions factories. Now, at first, there was quite a lot of challenges with this because a lot of male workers were worried that when they came home from the war, they might have lost their job to women. And there was also an argument that women generally were paid less and that would then encourage employers to keep on women at the end of the war rather than letting the men return to their jobs. So Lloyd George tried to set an example. Remember, he created his own weapons factory where he had women working in it. And essentially, they managed to solve the munitions crisis as well because of his work. So in your paragraph, you're going to be talking about all these kind of things. Remember, you'll need all of your notes from that first lesson on DORA and the increasing government powers. You're now going to be writing your 5-minute paragraph on DORA and how this helped Britain win the war effort. Remember that you're going to need to make sure that you're including detailed knowledge using your notes from that lesson, but also links back to the question. So you've got a list here of some key things to include. Make sure you use this as a kind of checklist to ensure that you're writing the perfect paragraph. You've got some optional sentence starters, which you can use here if you'd like to, but remember, you're not going to be marked down if you try and do something different. They're just there to get you started in case you're stuck. You're going to get 5 minutes on the timer, but remember, when it gets towards the end, if you feel like you need that extra little bit of time, you can pause the video to make sure you complete your paragraph properly. Okay, hope it goes well on that next paragraph. Off you go. The next area you need to write about is women and how they helped the war effort. Remember, this is what you did last lesson, so hopefully it's still fresh in your mind. Now, before the First World War broke out, there had been some issues between the government and lots of women who had joined the women's suffrage movement. Suffragists and suffragettes had been campaigning for the right to vote, and the suffragettes had caused quite a lot of disruption with that. Remember, we looked at what they did recently. However, when the war broke out, the women decided that there was no point in trying to fight for the right to vote if there was no country to fight for, and so they decided to support the war effort straight away, and they wanted to get involved. Now, it took until March 1915 before the government created a register for women willing to do war work. And in July that year, women grew frustrated over the fact that they weren't actually being used to volunteer for anything. And so in the end, 30,000 suffragettes ended up taking part in a march about the right to serve and how they wanted to help more in the war effort. Eventually, David Lloyd George became the Minister of Munitions and decided that he wanted to try and use women as a new workforce, especially because lots of men were now going off to fight. Remember, in total, 5 million British men went to go and fight in the First World War. And he needed to replace them, especially as lots of the young men that had been working in the factories had now gone off to go and fight. So he ended up using women to work in the munitions factories, and over 1 million British women ended up helping, risking their life working in dangerous conditions. These factories weren't nice places to work. They ended up having to deal with yellowed skin, and they ended up having the nickname of Canary Girls as a result. There were also sometimes explosions at these factories. For instance, a local one at Chilwell in Beeston ended up exploding, and lots of women unfortunately lost their lives. Women didn't just work in munitions factories though, they worked in loads of different jobs throughout the First World War. For instance, they were working in other factories, places like steel mills, driving buses, and also doing things like building ships. And when you did your notes on women last lesson, you might have written down some of the statistics about the number of women working in different areas in 1918. For instance, you might have written down something about the fact that there were 228,000 women working in agriculture, and therefore those are the women that were working for the land army, replacing lots of the farmers that had gone off to fight. The land army did involve women from all classes. What was quite interesting is that lots of middle class women who had never previously had a job ended up doing a lot of the labour on the farms. It wasn't just working within Britain though. Some women actually ended up volunteering and going to places like France as part of the VAD, the Voluntary Aid Detachment. These were women that ended up doing things like nursing and seeing the horrors of the war firsthand. These women often tended to be middle class women because they weren't paid for this work, and obviously a lot of working class women needed to support their families. There wasn't just this one organisation that helped with the war effort. There was also things like the WAAC, and this group were the ones that helped with the admin side often of the war, doing things like working as clerks and accountants and working as cooks as well, and basically supporting the armed forces. So women did lots of different things to help out in the war effort, and their service was recognised after the war when women got the right to vote for the first time in 1918. So they did play a really crucial role in the war effort and really helped Britain to have a successful home front. What you'll need to do now is to write your paragraph on women and think about all the things that they did. Remember, I've just gone through some of the key points, but you'll have lots more notes from last lesson in your books or on your pieces of paper. So what do you need to include on this paragraph on women? Well, you're going to get 5 minutes again, and in that time, you're going to want to describe the different roles women did in the war and making sure that you're explaining what the impact of this was. How did this help Britain's home front? How did it help Britain win the war? If you need some sentence starters, there are some here, but remember you don't have to use them. And remember that you can have slightly longer than 5 minutes. Try and stick to it if you can, but if you need some extra time, you can just pause the video and you can have those extra few minutes. Okay, best of luck with your paragraph on women. Off you go. We're now on the final paragraph of your answer, which is writing a conclusion. Now, you actually don't need the full 5 minutes on this because this will be slightly shorter than the rest of your paragraphs. All you've got to do in your conclusion is make your argument really clear and show off what your view is. And remember that you should be confident with this because you can't be wrong, it's just your opinion. So in this conclusion, I'd like you to talk about which aspect of the home front was the most important and whether or not you agree with the statement, which was your title, that rationing was the most important aspect. So you're going to have to say, overall, I agree or disagree with the statement, and then you're going to tell me which one or which ones were the most important and why. And remember, the idea is that you're really convincing the person that's going to be reading it about your view, and you're kind of trying to change their view potentially and make them see your side of the argument. So try and be as convincing as possible. Spend 5 minutes max, but 3 or 4 minutes would probably be more than enough. Okay, off you go. Well done for working so hard and finishing your first proper GCSE style answer. You've done a really good job, I'm sure. What I'd like you to do now is make sure that you actually submit your assessment so that your teacher can mark it for you. Now, ideally, you should be submitting this on Teams through the assignment section. Your teacher will have put the assignment on Teams and you can upload it to there straight away. Alternatively, you could upload it to your private channel of your class, Or if that doesn't work, then what you could do is go onto your school email and send an email to your teacher with the work attached. Any of those ways are fine, obviously ideal to send it through assignments, but as long as you get it to us, it's okay how you do it. Okay, so pause the video now and send that to your teacher.